Have you ever noticed that there's a version of you that starts everything with intensity, but almost never finishes? It's not a lack of ideas, it's not a lack of ability. In fact, you start better than most people. You research, you organize, you get excited, you visualize the outcome, and for a few days, it feels like this time it's real. But then something happens in the middle. The energy cools down, the urgency disappears, and what started strong becomes just another unfinished thing on your list. So let me ask you, why are you so good at starting, but so consistent at stopping? What exactly happens between the initial excitement and the silence of abandonment? If this happens to you, there's a strong chance you're not unmotivated, but someone who feels everything with too much intensity at the beginning. You don't start from empty impulse. You start because something made sense, because you saw possibility, because you imagined who you could become if you carried it through. And maybe you even recognize the pattern, the excitement of the first week, the clarity, the almost obsessive organization. You create a plan, a schedule, a vision, and then slowly the strength fades. It's not a disaster, not a dramatic collapse. It's a quiet cooling down. And the hardest part isn't stopping. It's realizing that once again, you're letting something that could have been big die in the middle. And that begins to accumulate into an uncomfortable question. Why do I keep doing this to myself? Before any explanation, let me take a weight off your shoulders. This doesn't mean you're naturally inconsistent, and it doesn't mean you lack willpower. Many times people who live this pattern are exactly the kind who care too much about what they do. You don't start things just to pass time, you start because it matters, because there's a bigger vision behind it. And let me bring in a concrete scene. Remember that project you decided to begin? You spent hours thinking about the name, the format, the final result. Maybe you even told someone about it. In the first few days, it felt unstoppable. Then a small difficulty appeared. A detail didn't turn out as expected, one less productive day, and something inside you whispered, maybe this isn't as good as I imagined. And instead of adjusting and continuing, you slowly pulled away. That's not laziness. That's sensitivity to your own internal standard of expectation. Now think with me as we're taking this apart piece by piece. The beginning is always full of energy because it lives in the field of possibility. At first, everything is still ideal. You imagine the final result, the improved version of yourself, the recognition, the change, the growth. But the moment execution truly begins, fantasy meets reality. And reality is imperfect. It's slow. It's repetitive. It doesn't have the same shine as the original idea. And that's exactly where many people lose momentum, not because they stopped wanting it, but because the mind falls in love with the vision and gets frustrated with the process. The problem isn't your ability to start. It's your relationship with the middle. The middle is where there's no glamour, only consistency. And consistency tests who you really are, not who you imagine you could be. And it's precisely in the middle that the conflict becomes quieter and more dangerous. At the beginning, you feel enthusiasm. At the end, you imagined feeling pride. But the middle is repetition. It's doubt. It's doing something without certainty that it will work. Think about the time you bought a course that could change your career. On the first day, you watched 3 lessons in a row, took notes, imagined where you'd be in 6 months. In the second week, you were watching less. By the third, you said he'd resume on the weekend. And today, it's still there. 80% possible, 0% completed. It wasn't a lack of time. It was the moment the course stopped being exciting and started demanding transformation. And here's the metaphor that might explain it better. You're like someone who runs excitedly almost to the end of a bridge, but stops before crossing completely. Because while you're still on the bridge, you can turn back. But crossing means entering new territory where you don't know exactly who you'll become. Let me be direct with you for a second. While the idea still lives in imagination, it protects your self-esteem. But when execution begins to reveal flaws, it feels like you're failing along with it. And a silent thought appears. Maybe I'm not as good at this as I thought. So to avoid confirming that doubt, you slow down. You step back. You say you'll return later. Because quitting in the middle preserves the fantasy of what could have been. And fantasy is comfortable. Reality demands growth. But this is where almost everyone misinterprets it. You think you stop because you lost interest. You think your motivation faded. You think you're just like this, but that's not it. Let me simplify it brutally. You don't abandon projects. You abandon versions of yourself that you're not yet able to sustain. There's a specific moment when everything shifts. It's not when the project becomes difficult. It's when it becomes real. When it stops being a beautiful idea and becomes something that can be judged, evaluated, compared. And in that instant, your mind activates a protection mechanism. I call this the safe start syndrome. While you're beginning, you're promising. While you're at the start, you're full of potential. But in the middle, you stop being a promise and start being performance. And performance can expose limits. And limits hurt, because they confront the idealized image you built about yourself. They show where skill is still missing, where imperfection still exists. And if you're not emotionally prepared to handle that friction, your brain prefers to preserve the identity of who I could be rather than risk discovering who you actually are. And that's why you almost start, but rarely finish. Now let me place this in front of you like a mirror, without softening it. How many things have you started in the last 2 years? Courses, projects, habit changes, business plans, workouts, ideas that felt brilliant at 3 a.m.? And how many did you carry to the real end? Not to the point where it still felt promising, but to the point where it required emotional maturity to continue, without applause, without immediate results, without certainty. Maybe you have a ready explanation. I lose interest quickly. I get bored easily. I'm more creative than disciplined. But what if that's just a comfortable narrative? Because losing interest hurts less than admitting you felt insecure in the middle. It's less threatening to say you changed your mind than to say you were afraid of not being enough. So answer honestly, do you really lose interest, or do you start pulling away when you realize you'll need to grow in order to sustain it? Because almost starting keeps your self-esteem intact, but finishing requires confrontation, and confrontation requires a level of maturity you're not always willing to access in that moment. So maybe the problem was never lack of focus. Maybe it was never laziness. Maybe you've just been stuck in safe start syndrome, where beginning is comfortable, but continuing feels threatening. And before closing this, let me add one honest discomfort. Maybe you're not afraid of failing. Maybe you're afraid of discovering that you'll need to stay a beginner longer than you'd like. Maybe what paralyzes you isn't the possibility of making mistakes, but the realization that excellence requires crossing a phase where you're still ordinary. And that hurts the ego. Now, if you were sitting in front of me asking, so what do I do with this? I wouldn't tell you to become a different person tomorrow. I tell you to do something much simpler and much harder. The next time you feel that drop in energy in the middle of something, don't quit. Don't reinvent. Don't start something new. Just continue small, ridiculously small. Because the antidote to almost starting isn't motivation. It's tolerating the middle. It's enduring the phase where you're not yet good, not yet recognized, not yet extraordinary. And that doesn't destroy your identity. It builds a new one. If any part of this video described you with uncomfortable accuracy, write in the comments which project you almost finished, but didn't. You don't need to explain. Just name it. Sometimes recognition alone weakens the pattern. And if you know someone who keeps starting 1,000 things and dropping them halfway, send this video to them. Maybe they don't need more motivation. Maybe they need to understand what they're protecting. Because in the end, you don't have a problem starting. You just haven't learned how to stay when the shine fades.